All right, well, this is our first episode of the podcast Beckett's Group Therapy. The episode title is To Lengthen My Short Leg, a Crutch for Samuel Beckett's Molloy. And my name is Hunter.
And this is Scott.
And I'm Nick.
And my name is Alice.
Awesome. So today we'll be talking about primarily Samuel Beckett's Molloy, diving into parts 1 and 2 and talking about loosely the connection between Molloy and Moran, his characters.
Yeah, and in trying to make sense of both the parts, so one thing that I looked at, and I'm curious to see what your guys' thought are, is how it relates to the Molloy as a character, relates to the Oedipus complex. And so throughout the course of part 1, Molloy's constantly searching for his mom, and it's like this love for like the idea that like when you're born, like the son's always in love with their mom. And so I'm curious to see what you think of it, because I think there's one reading that is a critique of the Oedipus complex, and then one that almost like bleakly reinforces it. And so I think you can read it one way where when you see Molloy as a character and you see like how not great he is and all of these things, you can read it as like if you constantly are only searching for your mom, like this is kind of the end that you'll meet. Or it's another critique or another view of it would be like everyone is going to end up like this and everyone's forced to search for their mom, I guess if you're male, in terms of the Oedipus complex. So I'm curious, like, how did you guys take, or what are your guys' thoughts on that?
With the Oedipus complex, is that Freudian?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Freud's Oedipus complex.
Okay. Sounds very much to be so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm just not sure if it's a critique of it or if it's like a reinforcement of being like, this is the reality of it and this is kind of how everyone's going to end up.
Mm-hmm.
So the one part of part 1 of Molloy that this kind of brings to mind, I don't know if you remember, and I can't find the exact quote, but it's about Molloy almost reimagining the moment of his birth.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the quote goes along the lines of like the first taste of the shit. And it's a really kind of grotesque depiction of this moment of childbirth and maternity. And I don't know if that kind of links into your point, but I feel like that might shed some light on Molloy's opinion of childbirth and maternity, and maybe even women in general. Yeah,
it's almost like a critique of it, and like in the way that it's rejecting it because he like searches for him, but we see the kind of person Molloy is, and I know that like most of us probably would not ever really want to be like Molloy in pretty much every way. So yeah, I think it might be a critique of the Oedipus complex. I don't know, what are your thoughts, Scott?
So kind of building off of Alice's point where with the shit and so forth. So throughout part 1, Molloy kind of shows this disdain for his mom, or hatred in that case. So I'm kind of interested in seeing what you have to say with respect to that and the critique.
Yeah, it's interesting because he like disdains her in a way, but he's still searching for her. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, I'm just having trouble figuring out like a real meaning from it, because sometimes I read it and I'm like, he's clearly rejecting the idea that like when you're born you're just immediately in love with your mom, and like that's an idea. Or and then at times I'm like, maybe he's reinforcing it because in the end, even if he has this disdain for her, he's still searching for her.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if any of you have read any of the theory called monster theory. There's a book by Jeffrey Jerome Cohen, I think that's how you pronounce his name, all about this idea of monster theory. And it's basically the idea that a culture's monsters, the monsters you find in media and literary texts, are kind of born out of cultural fears. A really basic example is Frankenstein and the fear of scientific progress. But then within that theory, there's this also kind of twin sense of desire for the cultural monsters that are created out of these fears. So I think I read the same kind of part that you're looking at, not through the lens of like the Freudian lens of the Oedipus complex, but I read it through this kind of lens of monster theory, so like a twin sense of fear and desire, which I guess does link in.
Yeah, I think that does, because there's almost like this almost societal fear of like the idea of like loving your mom in that kind of way is this fear, but there's also this desire, and I think you see that play out with Molloy's disdain, but also search for his mom, where there's like this fear, but there's still a desire to find her, and it's a really interesting point.
And I mean, there's been moments where Molloy's mom has acted almost as a beacon. I mean, bringing him back to the shore, literally, in a case, and dragging him through the forest, being a reason for him to come back. And I mean, still playing on this idea of Molloy's mom, I find it very interesting, like the maternal distinction between part one that we have with Molloy, and then the paternal distinction we have with like Moran and his son.
Yeah,
it's very interesting because in part one we're seeing a child looking for his mother. In part two we have a father with like the dealings and the repercussions necessarily of what his son does or what he even believes of his son. So I think it's the inverse there is very interesting. Yeah.
So do you read Molloy Moran, in this sense at least, as kind of like a character foil almost, like opposites? Or...
I don't know if I'd go so far as to say opposites as much as they somewhat cohere. I mean, because we know nothing of what Molloy's mother thinks of him as much as what he thinks of her. And then we know nothing of what, I mean, other than contextual stuff, of what Moran's son thinks of him. It's from the point of view of Moran, which I think has this odd coherence in this child, you know, whether it be paternal or maternal relationship. Yeah,
that's interesting.
Yeah.
And I'm curious to see how you guys read kind of the end of the text with Moran and Molloy. Like, do you think Moran is Molloy? Do you think Moran's son's Molloy? Do you think it's like a metaphor? And I know personally the way I kind of read it is just that it was more a metaphor that Moran is turning into Molloy, and it's just kind of showing that everyone has the potential to be Molloy, or some part of them is like Molloy. So I'm curious how you guys read it.
Yeah, so I definitely agree with you that there are some definite kind of similarities and ideas that can kind of lead you to believe that Moran is on the path to becoming Molloy. So you've got like the physical disabilities, like the legs, and then the reference to a son. So Molloy references, oh, I once had a son, doesn't really know where he is.
Yeah.
But we've spoken in class a lot about how the text is all about kind of this idea of decomposition and like almost the reduction of human beings down to the parts which are purely essential. So perhaps that rather that Molloy and Moran are the same individual, Beckett's kind of just showing us that when you kind of strip a human being down to its fundamental nature, we all kind of look the same, that there is this odd kind of similarities at the base level of humanity.
That is such an interesting take on it, because I think of like this universality that was applied to Molloy, like with uni, and like is it Gabert? Is that how we'll pronounce his name? Well, okay.
That's how we'll pronounce it.
I think it's so interesting because Moran goes to say that each of these people has like a conception of Molloy without going so far as to say that. So it's like, what is Molloy really representative of, and each person having an own understanding of him? It's kind of like everybody has that. Yeah, it's interesting.
And like there's already a lack of geographical and historical specificity in the text. And I think we accept that because we're used to reading texts set in different places and at different times. But what about this idea of like a lack of human specificity in the characters? And like we find this more uncomfortable because it kind of, well, not only is it something we're not used to, but it also kind of shines a light on elements of the human experience that we don't particularly want to acknowledge. That is my kind of suggestion. What do you guys think?
I know that when I'm reading the text, it's this weird thing of like, when you see Molloy, it's like, that's not someone I want to really identify with. And then I feel like Beckett does a great job of like making me see that there's like parts of that in everyone, but also I feel like most people want to be as far away from that as possible. So I think that's pretty interesting.
I would agree. I think it shows kind of a vulnerability in people that they don't want to identify with somebody that they don't understand, but it's still in them innately. So I'd feel like, especially this kind of goes back to the reliability of Molloy and Morone in that case, and where, as I read it kind of going along, you see these connections between two individuals, but at the same time, the reliability, I think, kind of shows that there isn't a conclusion that you can make of one being the other or turning into the other. And that kind of goes back to what Alice was saying before with just with those characteristics like Morone developing the stiffness in his legs and so forth, that you can't really, I don't think it would be in my best interest to make a conclusion of one being the other or vice versa. It just goes back to that decomposition of innately we all have Molloy in us. In a sense.
Yeah, and one thing that I like really struggle with when reading Molloy is because of the unreliability of the narrators and the split between the two parts. Like I'm just constantly like trying to create a concrete meaning, but I just feel like every time I do, there's so many contradictions, and that's just like one of the reasons it was like a really hard text to read, but also like an enjoyable text to read at the same time.
Well, and I mean, that's what's so interesting about the thought of universal application, or like this idea that Molloy exists in us all. Because for me, it's like this literal interpretation. You know, we go back to part 1 and we learn of these figures that Molloy watches from, you know, this rocky boulder figure. You see A and you see C, and you see them walking through this pasture. You know, one turning around, passing one another. And I mean, ever since part 2, where we see that this one figure stumbles upon, potentially the character C, stumbles on Moran, and Moran sees his face appear to be the same as his own, I've had nothing but literal, like, transposition. Like, I've had nothing but putting that in his place. So I think of, like, C and Moran as nearly synonymous. Which I find to be such an interesting case. I have a quote that I ended up finding from page 11 of Molloy, and it is Molloy actually talking about C, who we know later on to be the one pursuing A. And he says, "He looks so old, and it is a sorry sight to see him solitary after all these years. So many days and nights unthinkingly given to that rumor, rising at birth and even earlier. What shall I do? What shall I do?" I feel like if we apply that to Moran, that's his whole narrative right there. Is Moran is a figure that is just wondering what to do with himself. And he even ends up going so far as killing C, which, so I guess I'm just curious about your thoughts on that, about him killing this figure that potentially is a manifest or representative of him.
Something unique about that too is after he does kill C in that context, he says he doesn't recognize him anymore. He doesn't see the similarities that he saw before. So I'm kind of interested in what you guys made of that.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Not sure.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. Yeah, I just find it interesting if we were to parallel that Molloy is this figure being chased, A, in part 1, and C is Moran, then it's interesting to see that Moran is representative in this figure that he himself has killed.
And I feel like that parallel could even run deeper, because it's like, from what I just said earlier and how I'm always searching for meaning, it's like I'm always trying to chase the meaning, and like the way that Molloy's chasing his mom, the way that C is chasing A, and like, does it even matter? Like, is that like where I should be focusing, like when I'm reading the text? You know, I think that's an interesting parallel.
Yeah,
like the idea that, does it even matter if Molloy and Moran are the same person, if Moran is the same person as the individual that he kills? Like, is this going against what the purpose of the text is trying to do? But yeah, it's a really interesting point, and not something I've considered before. But going back to the idea of Moran essentially killing the individual that looks just like him, perhaps that could be indicative of this sense that we all have of not wanting to identify with Molloy and Moran, and yet feeling this strange, uncomfortable kind of connection to the deeper parts of the human experience that they represent almost. And Moran kind of rebelling against that almost. But again, this is not something I've considered before, and it's a really interesting point.
Well, I mean, going back to this idea that Molloy might be this basic understanding of human nature, if we take this all as an act of pursuit, it's like Moran kills C, who is practically, we could see it as synonymous of himself, which is an act of suicide. And then in that pursuit, if he does become Molloy, it's like breaking him down to this basic, universal, aspect of humanity. Then he's in pursuit of his mother. It's like, what exactly is there,
Yeah.
Back, I mean, coming full circle back to your original thought, what is there in pursuing his mother,
Yeah.
It's a very interesting concept.
I'm curious to what you think, Alice, about like the view of monstrosity, and like, is there like an idea of when Moran kills like basically like a reflection of himself, and then doesn't identify afterwards? Like, is there like a perspective of like how we view monstrosity, like in ourselves, or how we remove ourselves maybe after? Like, if we originally see ourselves as the same, and then when we kill that person, and you have this like viewpoint of that person was a monster, but I just did something bad, so I'm gonna remove myself from that by saying we're different. Like, I don't know if there's if there's a connection there, but
it's a very interesting point, and not something that's easily kind of coheres to the readings I've read on the topic of monster theory. Generally the theory focuses on the division of the self and the other, with the other being the monsters representing the cultural fears. And I don't know, maybe because there isn't really any culture in the text Molloy, so the kind of Molloy and Moran as the narrators kind of decide themselves what is culture, and therefore what is monstrosity, what is the self and what is the other. These are all ideas that don't really cohere into one single point. But yeah, definitely something to think about.
Yeah, because I definitely have not read that much on this topic, but I just think it's interesting, like, how monstrosity would be viewed if the self is like projected on someone else that's viewed as a monster. So there's like that connection that they're the same in a way, and then try to remove yourself from that.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's like, Beckett making newfound ground again, but it's like an idea of, dare I not say cultural suicide, but a sense of suicide in one killing that part of themselves that they find in another. Yeah, it's a very interesting thought.
I think a quote too that kind of away from the monstrosity, but dealing with how Moran, in this case, is killing himself, or the suicide that we're kind of talking about. It's on 28 of Molloy in part 1. Molloy says the best fact is the most you can hope for is to be a little less in the end than the creature you were in the beginning and in the middle. But in this sense, Moran's becoming very far away, I would say, from the creature he was in the beginning.
It's a great quote.
Yeah, but in a way, because like, if we're arguing that Moran at the end of part 2 is closer to like what Molloy is in part 1, but I also think there's like this weird connection of like how Molloy is kind of like a child, so it's almost like Moran's like coming full circle to maybe he's not who he was at the beginning of the part, but he's probably closer to who he was the beginning of maybe in his life.
Yeah, that
could be an interesting perspective.
And also the fact that Moran, he goes on this kind of quest, but then he does return to his home. Whereas Molloy kind of just goes on an aimless wandering and ends up in a ditch somewhere. Moran actually does kind of make a return trip as well.
And it's interesting that Molloy, even though he doesn't make it back, he's still trying to return home to his mom.
Yeah.
Which is interesting on the fact that it almost like comes full circle
Yeah.
in a lot of parts of this text.
At one point he would have left his mother, and then he's trying to get back to I see what you're getting at there.
Well, and I mean, I was kind of in this framework, thinking about Camus as I had been, and existentialism as we were working through this. But, I mean, in part 2, Moran mentions Sisyphus, or Beckett, or whoever we're going to say mentions Sisyphus. And it's an act of Sisyphus pushing this rock and it traveling all the way down the hill. Moran, in this case, would be chasing the boulder, taking this way down and then pushing it all the way back. So he ends right back up at home where he had originally began, made it down the hill and back, which is interesting to me because, he mentions Sisyphus and this fact that you can take a different way, and this idea of the monotonous, habitual nature of things, and yet still living it out. So, yeah, I found that so interesting. But that's where my mind was also at.
And then actually, I have a question for you, Scott, and I hope I don't put you on the spot because
I'm ready for it.
There we go. Because of your economics background, and this might be a little removed, but I'm just curious to see if you can spell out how Molloy or Moran is acting in the deconstruction or decomposition of themselves economically, because I remember you talking a little bit about that, and I think that would be an interesting perspective if I didn't put you on the spot too much here.
No, it's a great question, Nick. Thanks for asking it. But actually, that actually goes right along with the paper I'm writing for this, because what I'm looking at is the health economics of the incurious seeker, or the Molloy in this case. And the biggest problem with the decomposition, I wouldn't almost call it downfall, but just with what happens to Molloy, it's mostly because of what his objective is to find his mom, but he doesn't take the necessary health precautions in order to fulfill that objective, which is why he decomposes, he stiffens, his mind kind of numbs in a sense. So from an economic standpoint, you can use this Grossman model where it identifies, or it shows his happiness or marginal utility for being able to spend his day. So in 24 hours of the day, Molloy can in this model, he can either spend time being sick, which towards the end is all he does, right? Yeah. He can either spend time working, he doesn't have a job, or he can spend time doing what he wants, which between being sick and doing what he wants is all he does in the day, which kind of leads to why he doesn't improve health and why he doesn't find his mom and eventually decomposes, which might be inevitable for everybody eventually. So that's kind of the full circle again.
Yeah, I just think it's really interesting that in this text there's so much where we're searching for meaning and literary ideas, and that even throughout economics, it really interestingly applies to why Molloy is the way he is, and how also, because that's applied, obviously that's theory about everyone and how that works into the almost representation of how everyone has a part of Molloy, or everyone could end up being like Molloy, which is kind of a scary thought, but maybe a reality that we have to face.
An economic analysis of Molloy.
Yeah, there we go.
It's fun stuff.
Yeah.
Almost feels like you're trying to take the most concrete discipline you can find with the least concrete text and try and fuse them both together.
Yeah.
And the frustrating part is with economic practice and so forth, you have to make these assumptions about people being rational. I wouldn't necessarily say Molloy is the most rational person out there.
Absolutely not.
So he kind of just contradicts the normal economic assumptions that we make about everyone, and it makes you ask, do they even apply in this case? Well, I try to make the argument it does, but Molloy would probably argue different.
Yeah, but the text tries to say it doesn't apply because there's not a lot that's rational here.
And we can't even isolate Molloy, much less deem him to be rational or irrational. So I find that very interesting. To
and
apply that.
Yeah, and with the fact that he's an unreliable narrator,
Yeah,
like how much
exactly.
of this is even true, which makes it
Yeah.
hard to be like, is he really being rational? Because
Mhm.
we don't even know if he's telling us the truth, and he probably isn't on most things.
Yeah, it's like we're trying to find meaning in this text and make links and connections, but there are moments when Molloy and Moran just say simply, I'm not going to tell you this, or I actually don't,
Yeah.
like, this is irrelevant, or perhaps I'll come back to this later. So on what grounds are we trying to actually find meaning, or like conclusions, essentially?
Yeah, and it's interesting how we struggle so much to find meaning, but then we can still apply something like economics, and you can see how parts of the text can be influenced just by like human nature through economics. So it's like there is this weird like double-sided thing where it's like I cannot find any meaning out of this, but because I can't find any meaning, I feel like I'm getting a lot of meaning out of this text. It's like this weird parallel.
It's kind of humorous almost to that point. It's
Yeah.
like, yeah, you're spending all this time reading it. I'm going to give you the literary middle finger, kind of.
Exactly.
Tell you this might not even be applicable in this situation.
Yeah, that's incredible to me. There's like these metaphorical derivatives and literal ties that we're trying to make.
Yeah.
But, you know, I mean, if not to be exemplary of Molloy as a whole, you know, we end on this note that it is raining, it is midnight. It is not raining, it is not midnight. I mean,
Like,
these
what?
absurd contradictions
Mhm.
are
Yeah.
just really reveal the narrative as a whole. If we can call it that.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Narrative.
if it even is one.
Yeah.
So perhaps a final question to
Yeah.
end on for everyone is, why did Beckett write this text? Like, what was his almost purpose or desire in so doing, if anything?
Yeah, I don't know if I can't say that he had a specific purpose because I obviously have never talked to him.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I think the text is doing is really, even though the whole narrative of decomposing as Molloy and Moran, the text itself like decomposes or deconstructs just like my idea as a reader of what I typically think I should be getting out of a text, and really pushes it in really different ways on how it really reveals how I am always looking for meaning, and maybe I should be looking at different things within a text. I think there's so many things that could be argued is the purpose of this text, but that's one thing that at least when I read it, I got the feeling of, and that made me think about. So what do you guys think, Scott?
It's very meta.
Yeah, I gotta get real meta here.
Yeah.
I mean, contextually, too, I think it's significant to acknowledge when the situations in Beckett's experience with life and war and so forth, and applying that meaning. That being said, there's a million things that I am not positive on that could be. When I read the text specifically for me, one of the things that I thought was significant was just how we kind of came to that conclusion where Molloy could be every one of us when we decompose, and maybe it's just more prevalent in the times that he was writing it with war and so forth, and his experience with the Red Cross and so forth, and those cities that were just destroyed.
Yeah, and I think because like one of the readings was like from just like a literary, like how does it fit into like literary canon and how I think about literature, but from like the perspective of like how Molloy and Moran make me feel, it's very much like this is like he's connecting humanity in a way, as he's also decomposing other parts of humanity, I think, throughout the text.
Yeah, I think it's important. I mean, going back to what you had said previously, Nick, is acknowledging what backgrounds each of us is coming into this with.
Yeah.
I mean, Scott, looking to the fact that you're coming into it economic minded, and, you know, looking at, especially from my own perspective of coming into it with this philosophical background, for me, it's been very existential. I mean, very much so. And it comes down to this concept, which, if I butcher it, forgive me, because I just learned about it. But it's this idea of cultural pluralism, that within a text, you know, there's no innate meaning from the author necessarily, as much as, you know, there are right ways of deriving from the text, and that could be what each of us have done here. You know, this idea of, here I've pulled pieces of absurdism and
Yeah.
existentialism and what it is to be human, and just what each of us has pulled out might be equally correct of what Beckett is doing here.
Yeah, and
if anything at all.
And I think, Alice, you've talked about that Goat Hand with Barth's essay on the death of the
Yeah.
author, and just how it's definitely a text that feels like you can get so many meanings that maybe there is no meaning that was meant by Beckett himself.
Yeah, so perhaps I misphrased my question in referencing Samuel Beckett, because to me this is one of the texts that really I feel like I should really disconnect it from the author the most. It almost feels like a landscape from which everyone with their own different backgrounds and spheres of knowledge should just take different things, different meanings. So that's kind of what I get from the text and what links into the death of the author theory.
Yeah, well then I think that's it for this first episode of the podcast. And hopefully we'll see you guys for the next episode when we're talking about Waiting for Godot.
Yes, wonderful. That was great. That was Beckett's group therapy.